So I want to first say thank you to everyone who's joining us today after coming last night. I hope you enjoyed the second day of our conference. Everyone who is joining today, welcome. I want to just start us off with a moment of silence for the martyrs of this year's genocide, of last year's, the year before, and of every year before that. Thank you. When I was a child, we didn't say Palestine. We whispered it, we held it in our hearts, one of the few places that it existed. I think I've attended protests chanting Free Palestine since I was a child, but I'll be honest, I didn't always believe that it would happen, not back then. I thought it was something that we told ourselves and we chanted it, but it wasn't destined necessarily for us, at least not in our lifetime. It wasn't until my adult life, in recent years, when discussions of freedom came back into existence, refreshed and renewed during especially the Unity Intifada for me, and we all started asking ourselves, could Palestine really become free? And collectively, it seems, we all began to speak of it, to ask this question, could Palestine really be free? But now, we aren't just asking. We're not waiting and wondering, could Palestine be free? We're fighting for it, we're advocating for it, we're insisting on it. We're bringing it into existence. And this is what brought us into this year's conference. Now, I have a child myself, and he doesn't just say Palestine, he screams it. Free, free Palestine. And he and this entire generation are going to scream it into existence. Because the future is Palestine, and that is what this year's conference is going to be all about. So welcome to PACC Conference 2024. Thank you for being here today. I'm going to hand it off to Amineh. Al-Aydi is going to be our beautiful moderator for today.
We can just share it, then we can talk it going. I'm happy to do that.
Hi everyone, my name is Amineh Al-Aydi. I'm president of Drew University's chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine. I'm so excited to be here with you all today and to be initiating this conversation at PACC about political advocacy with Omar Baddar. Sorry. I was just telling him my brother's name is Baddar and I saw it and I was like, oh. But I messed it up. So, Baddar. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Omar Baddar is a Palestinian-American political advocate and communications professional based in Washington, D.C. His lifelong work is dedicated to challenging U.S. policies that harm communities at home and abroad, with emphasis on U.S. support for Israeli apartheid, which was the focus of his academic research. Omar has participated in dozens of panels, lectures, and debates on college and university campuses throughout the United States. His media appearances include CNN, MSNBC, BBC, Al Jazeera, Sky News, Voice of America, and other outlets, and his writings have been appeared in Salon, Newsweek, HuffPost, The Daily Beast, and Jadaliyya, among other platforms. He previously served as Communications Director at the Institute for Middle East Understanding, Deputy Director of the Arab American Institute, digital producer and presenter with Al Jazeera, and executive director at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee of Massachusetts. For this session, I'll be asking Omar questions regarding the importance of political advocacy in the recent movement of Palestine. We will discuss the overall long-term goals of the movement, political avenues to achieving those goals, and the barriers that lie within. We will have an interactive discussion on why and how we must sustain this movement in the face of political headwinds on this path to a free Palestine. We will follow the session with some time for a Q&A from our audience. If you're tuning in from home, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and one of our tech moderators will be on to help us facilitate. Thank you so much, Omar, for coming here today. So I'm just going to start going through the questions, and yeah. Okay, so reflecting on the current geopolitical landscape and the Palestinian liberation movement, where do you believe we are in this historical moment, and how would you assess the key challenges and opportunities that define the present context for those advocating for Palestinian rights and self-determination?
Thank you so much, Amineh, and thank you. Honestly, when I think of reasons to be hopeful, it really is being in spaces like this one. Seeing a thriving Palestinian community center, seeing young people all over the hall, speaking to people like Amineh, these are the kinds of things that give you hope about the fact that our movement, that our community is becoming more and more empowered. Because today's talk was going to be on political advocacy primarily, I had intended to speak really forcefully and passionately and to talk about the importance of being a voice for the voiceless, because we are in this privileged position. And then I lost my voice in the process, which, as a tiny bit of irony, but because we are Palestinians and we are used to working against the odds and being at a disadvantage and plowing ahead anyway, I figured that we just have to proceed with this conversation. In terms of this moment globally and in the US, it's for us and for people who are advocating for a free Palestine, we have always had a great deal of global sympathy and solidarity and understanding for our cause. And there's always been a unique problem of experiencing this in the United States, of being in a country that is the biggest funder of the Israeli military to the tune of nearly 40 billion every single decade, the single biggest diplomatic protection for Israel. The US uses its veto, has used its veto more than 50 times to shield Israel from international accountability at the UN Security Council. And it is a country where the political landscape and the media culture are deeply frustrating. It is, and it's kind of ironic, just to kind of touch a little bit on media coverage specifically, to say that Palestine and Israel, one of the most covered topics in American media, and yet the least understood. So there's a problem with the fact that it's not lack of coverage, it is the kind of coverage that keeps us stuck in the situation where Americans watch endlessly this violence that unfolds on the ground, but never has any context to understand what they're actually looking at and understanding American complicity in it. We have a situation in which, you could just imagine the scenario, if it was 4 armed intruders with guns break into a home, and the homeowner picks up a baseball bat and they shoot and kill the homeowner who's trying to protect his family. That is a very specific story that you would need that context to understand. And if you turn on the nightly news, and the nightly news says 5 people armed with guns and baseball bats get into a fight and one of them dies, on a technicality, there are no lies told in that framing, but it is so devoid of context that the person listening to that coverage has no idea what actually happened. And that's precisely the problem here, is that we have a situation in which Palestinians have been denied their basic human rights for decade after decade, and that is the driving force of all the violence that we are witnessing. Where Israel is an occupying force in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, their presence there is illegal. It should not be there. But yet, when you turn on the news and you hear about a confrontation between Palestinian youth and Israeli soldiers, if you don't tell people that this is occupied Palestinian territory, where Israeli soldiers are invaders, the audience has no sense of what is actually unfolding in these confrontations, apart from generic ideas of Palestinians and Israelis hating each other or being in conflict or whatever. And when it comes to Palestinian humanity in the process, that also is rather invisible. You'll notice in this current crisis in Gaza, prior to October 7th, there was no coverage of what was happening in Gaza. No coverage of what was happening in Palestine more broadly. On October 6th, Palestinians in Gaza, unemployment was nearly half the population, food insecurity was very high. Palestinians have no airport in Gaza because Israel bombed it and would not allow them to rebuild it. They have no seaport. They have no access to the outside world. They are prisoners in a massive camp in which they cannot leave or come in, can't trade with the outside world. There is no economic opportunity, and that means there is no better future, there's no hope for a future for people's children in Gaza. And if you remove that context, and it has been completely absent in US media coverage, then people don't know. When they look at an event like October 7th, when suddenly we decide to cover what's happening because Israelis are on the receiving end of violence, if that's the only time coverage begins, you develop a bias in the people who are watching to not see Palestinians as human beings and to always perceive that Israel is responding to violence when we know that Israel is initiating violence because the occupation itself is violence. The default, the status quo is violence against Palestinians. No coverage of the 250 Palestinians who had been killed from the beginning of 2023 until October 6th. They call that a ceasefire. And they say Hamas broke a ceasefire on October 7th. But they're telling you, anybody who calls that a ceasefire is telling you that a status quo in which Palestinians are denied freedom, have their land stolen from them, have their water taken from them, and have their children murdered and thrown indefinitely into military prisons, that is a ceasefire because Israelis are safe. But the second Israelis are not safe, that's conflict. That is deeply internalized racism in the way that we look at this issue. And it is reflected in American political discourse on this that reacted to Israelis being killed on October 7th, and I don't want to minimize that. There were serious atrocities committed on October 7th. Nonetheless, you see a level of humanity and a level of concern that is completely absent when it comes to Palestinian victims of violence. And it's strange to be Palestinian in this country, to be told day in and day out by your media and by your political leaders that your life is worth less than somebody else's life. And to be expected to go on living knowing that they're telling us that our children don't matter as much as Israeli children, and expect us to have a sense of belonging here. This is a moment of serious crisis for me as a Palestinian American, in which I've always seen American policy as flawed, but to have seen this level of callousness in the face of mass murder, mass starvation of children, more than 10 of them have been killed so far by being denied access to food, in the face of Israeli soldiers posting TikToks, taunting dead Palestinians and mocking them and gloating at Palestinian suffering, to then turn around and be told by our political establishment that that's not a big deal. Yeah, maybe it's a little over the top, but in general it's fine. And to continue US support for these kinds of policies is a deeply alienating experience. The only hopeful sign I see in all this is that in spite of this wall-to-wall propaganda that we are facing and this discourse, Israel's actions are so monstrous that you can't hide it with whatever level of propaganda, that you still end up with an overwhelming majority of Americans supporting a ceasefire in spite of being subjected to that kind of propaganda, which tells you the magnitude of the atrocities that we are suffering. So it is a very difficult moment, no question about it, but Israel's actions are so blatant and so extreme that you can't help but see a glimmer of hope about the fact that things are changing, people are recognizing the horrors and the injustice people are subjected to. And like I said, being in a space like this and seeing the amount of energy that we're witnessing are all signs that we are moving in a better direction. There is some mobilization that is happening that is really worthwhile.
Thank you so much for sitting there and defining everything for us. I think that's so valuable to hear it in your insight and to see that hope as a Palestinian in this time. I think you were talking about, you're going into how else on October 7th, when all the news came out, what else would have been perceived if you didn't have the other context, which was not given to the common American person. And so I do want to just take a moment to appreciate all that you do in terms of pushing that boundary and making sure that our voices are heard and that we are talking about that this is a 100-century-old issue plus some. So I appreciate that. I'm going to move on to the next question. In the context of Palestinian liberation, how do you see the role of international actors, both governmental and non-governmental, in influencing the trajectory of the Palestinian cause?
Look, as I mentioned a second ago, I think the international community is on our side. There's no question about it. People throughout the world get and sympathize with the Palestinian struggle and understand that Palestinians are an occupied people who deserve freedom and are being denied it. The question then becomes, what role does the rest of the international community have in this? And the truth of the matter is that there's unfortunately a limited role because people are willing to speak truth to power, but they're not willing to intervene and stick their necks out beyond simply stating what they're witnessing. And the reason is because the United States is an incredibly powerful country, and people who want to maintain positive relations with the US, not to be put on sanctions lists, to maintain good trade with the US, to be able to rely on US favors, so to speak, internationally, there's only so far that you can go. And that includes neighboring countries, by the way, in the region too. Like Jordan and Egypt, for example, are two, apart from the fact that their populations are overwhelmingly supportive of Palestinians, there's no question about that. But even the governments are not happy about what Israel is doing in Gaza. They see that as a destabilizing force. And yet they're only willing to go so far. But ultimately will maintain diplomatic relations with Israel, will maintain trade relations with Israel. And the reason is from their perspective, they can't afford to fall out of favor with the United States. And they know that really squeezing Israel in a moment like this might put you on the enemies list. And that, you can expand that even beyond to European countries. This will tell you Israeli settlements are war crimes under international law. Stealing land, throwing the native population off of it, building settlements on it, transferring your own people onto it. They tell you these are war crimes, but then insist on continuing to import products from these very war crimes into European markets. So they're not willing to take the necessary action, and that's always the frustrating point, is that it's not a matter of convincing the international community that we have a problem. It's an international community that understands that there is a problem, but not seeing the incentive to actually act and live up to their moral responsibility. We have institutions that are supposed to intervene in these situations. We have attempts at getting the International Criminal Court to investigate Israeli war crimes. They come under immense pressure from the United States, and they slow those down, they take it easy, and the Palestinian Authority, which effectively functions as a subcontractor to the occupation, also gets bullied by the United States based on financial funding to say, okay, fine, we won't push for that far, we'll push, just limit to verbal protest whenever Israel commits a crime. You have the UN Security Council can't act because of US vetoes. You have now what's happening at the International Court of Justice, I think is incredibly meaningful, this genocide case that is brought by South Africa against Israel. The reason why it's meaningful is because South Africa, again, has nothing to gain strategically from bringing that case against Israel. If they were to do what's good for them, it is to stay out of this, maybe protest or whatever. But South Africa has a unique history, one in that they've experienced apartheid themselves, so they know exactly what Palestinians are going through. And two, Israel was one of the biggest supporters of the apartheid regime of segregation in South Africa, and they remembered that about them. And so South Africa is sticking their neck out for Palestinians, is pursuing this case, and it is difficult to know how the ICJ is going to land at the end of all this, because as much as we try to pretend that these institutions are impartial, those judges come from countries in which political pressure does get applied. But at least we're at the point to where the case that South Africa presented was so overwhelming. If you read their 80-plus page submission, all of the evidence is based on UN reports and human rights reports and the statements of Israeli leaders themselves and what Israeli soldiers are documented to have done. That case is overwhelming to the point that even a politically influenced court can't dismiss those charges out of hand, is considering them seriously, and that case is actually proceeding. I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket, so I don't want to raise expectations or hopes about where that would end, but there are avenues in which, if the International Court of Justice rules correctly on this at the end of the way, there's the problem of it being very slow, and every day that goes by, another 70 children in Gaza are murdered. So this is not something that we can just wait for. We have to act now to stop this mass slaughter that is taking place in Gaza. But if it eventually comes out, even years down the road, that will fundamentally change Israel's relationship with the rest of the world. That these countries that are willing to criticize softly Israeli atrocities will be put in a position in which maintaining a relationship with a country that is engaged in genocide, as documented by the International Court of Justice, would be very, very significant. So I think there is hope on the international stage for some escalation in light of the U.S. abdicating its responsibility in this moment.
Thank you so much. So you were talking a little bit about how the neighboring countries, they're still supplying oil to Israel, they're still doing their thing. How do you think that we can sit here and still expect them to act that they'll ever shake off the shackles of Western colonization? Do you think that's still a possibility or a hope that we can hold on to, or just forget about it?
Where there's hope in the region, it's not in the governments. It's in the fact that the people across the entire region support Palestinians. Even in countries that are pushing, I don't remember what the exact numbers were, but like there's a lot being talked about right now about the effort to get Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel. But when they interview Saudis, when they do polling in Saudi Arabia, the population overwhelmingly wants to boycott Israel completely over its mistreatment of Palestinians. And that's kind of remembering that separation between authoritarian governments in the Middle East and the people of the Middle East. We're talking about two very different entities in this sense. And that, to me, is part of the reason to want a more democratic and free future for the entire Middle East. Because if these governments represented their people, they would not allow for current policy to exist as it currently does. It is unclear to me whether these governments, how far they're willing to go and what moment would force them to act. But whatever action that they do, you've loosely got political teams, you've got the pro-US side, which by extension means relationships with Israel, and even though criticism may exist, it will be on the softer side. You've got the other team that is willing to be much more antagonistic, sort of the Iran axis with Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, and so on, which are being much more confrontational. But ultimately, the only risk as far as the regional aspect is concerned is a particular confrontation between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Israel, which Hezbollah wants to avoid in principle. I don't think they want a full confrontation with Israel because they know the consequences for Lebanon would be devastating. But at the same time, because they've championed the Palestinian cause so publicly, they also can't afford to sit on their hands and do nothing. And so they're engaging in this extremely limited warfare across the border of firing rockets at Israeli soldiers right on the border. Israel retaliates, and Israel is consistently threatening to escalate. And Hezbollah is stuck in a situation in which they can't back off completely, but they also don't want an escalation. Yet there's a recipe in this situation that seems to be leading towards escalation. And there's endless statements from Israeli leaders about how, whether it's now, whether it's when Gaza is over, or whatever, about the necessity of taking on Hezbollah in a more serious way. And the critical difference between Hezbollah and Hamas is that Hezbollah has substantially bigger rockets, much more accurate ones. What Israel is doing in Gaza, Hezbollah is capable of doing, not quite to the same extent, but to a significant degree. Huge damage within Israel. So if that war does escalate and get out of hand, we are looking at a completely unknown dynamic in which, honestly, the future becomes very, very uncertain for everyone. What is guaranteed is that there's going to be thousands of dead Lebanese and thousands of dead Israelis as well, and a completely unknown scenario of how that would even wrap up at the end. We are in uncharted territory, in a sense. But the status quo of mass Palestinian death while the world refuses to stop it is what is getting us closer and closer to the brink of something that is really unknown right now.
Thank you so much for that insight. I'm kind of going to take us on a little bit of a different direction. The concept of a two-state solution has been a central focus in discussions about Israel and Palestine. So do you believe this remains a viable option? And if not, what alternative solutions do you see for achieving a just and lasting peace in the region?
I remember when this question used to be very contentious. About 10 years ago, it used to be the grounds of huge debates. One state versus two states was always the ground for that. I think it's important to, for the sake of setting context, to understand what the two-state solution is first. The two-state solution is a massive Palestinian compromise for the sake of settling the conflict. That's what it is. Palestinians were driven from 78%, we'll call it 80% to round up, of historic Palestine when Israel was created. 750,000 people driven from their homes. Hundreds, more than 500 Palestinian towns and villages destroyed to ensure that those refugees don't get to return. For the longest time, Palestinians insisted that they have the right to return to all of their historic homeland. And that is a natural right, it's guaranteed by international law, and it's basic moral and human common sense that people deserve the ability to go back home. By the 1980s, Palestinians came to realize that Israel is incredibly powerful. It has the backing of the United States and so many other countries. And that the idea of a full dismantling of Zionism and creating a reality in which Palestinians are free in their historic homeland seems very unlikely in that situation, and came to terms with the idea that they're going to reach a compromise in order to settle the conflict and at least have a state and some freedom. And the idea of that is Palestinians recognize Israel as recognized by international law, and then Israel does what it's obligated to do under international law. So this is not Israel doing Palestinians any favor. International law is very clear about the fact that Israel is obligated to leave the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And that was supposed to be the idea of a two-state solution. Palestinians get 20%, Israel gets nearly 80%, and we call it a day. And what Israel did throughout the so-called peace process is, instead of withdrawing from the occupied territories, it did the exact opposite. It systematically expanded throughout the Palestinian territories. It gave Palestinians control over some small cities. They can have Ramallah, Nariha, and eventually Nablus and whatever else. But Israeli settlement expansion throughout the West Bank grew tremendously. The settler population doubled throughout the so-called peace process. And Palestinians had less and less control of their own land and their own lives. And it was clear that Israel was never serious about the prospect of giving Palestinians a viable state. And that is why the so-called peace process failed. To even call it a peace process is an insult. It was a sham that Israel used as cover to entrench its control of the occupied Palestinian territories, without ever being serious or seriously considering allowing Palestinians to be free in a state of their own. And so we find ourselves now in this moment where 750,000 Israelis live in the West Bank, in occupied territory, and in East Jerusalem. And a lot of people have said, the prospect of a meaningful Israeli withdrawal is over, it's behind us. The entrenchment of Israel in the occupied territories is so deep, there is no room for separation. And so we should go back to our original demand of a single state, single democratic state in which Israeli settlers don't have to leave anymore. They can stay, but they have to stay as equals to Palestinians, not as a privileged class in an apartheid system. And that one-state vision is gaining momentum. Not in Israel. The political spectrum within Israel is extremely moving in the opposite direction. Israelis are increasingly more and more right-wing. That is an extremely concerning trend that Americans should be aware of. When we think of the United States, we think things are trending in a better direction. Younger Americans are more progressive, more conscientious, care about international law and human rights more than their parents did. In Israel, it's the exact opposite. Whatever is left of the peace camp in Israel is the older generation. And younger people are more anti-Palestinian and more racist and more hostile to the concept of Palestinian statehood or human rights or equality or all of that, that things are simply trending in the wrong direction. I find myself in this moment, if I could wave a magic wand, certainly I would want a single state in which Palestinians are free in their entire homeland and everybody can live in peace and safety together. Absent that, I don't see that there is a political framework to get to either one state or two states right now. It does not look like we have the fundamental political reality that will allow to either of these options to emerge. And yet the alternative is permanent apartheid or ethnic cleansing and genocide. Those are the choices that we're currently facing. And so I wish I could make a recommendation about the path that we should pursue, but I don't really think that that's the appropriate, because I don't have a clear political conception of how we get from point A to point B. It is difficult for me to kind of make that sort of recommendation. But what is undeniable is that US support for Israeli occupation and apartheid is morally indefensible, is strategically harmful to the US, and is simply leading us down a path of further violence. And so even without the broader political vision of how we end up with one state or two states or 16 states or no states or whatever it might be, ending US support for Israel is step one to whatever future vision that we have. And that's what we have to start.
Thank you so much. So, that was great. I wanted to say that you were talking about we don't have a political framework right now to even move towards that direction. Like, we need to establish that first. So, going off that point, I wanted to ask about balancing diplomacy and grassroots activism and how important that is to the Palestinian crisis. So, How can these two approaches complement each other, and do you believe one is more impactful than the other in the current political landscape? How do we leverage both without watering down the narrative?
Look, that is a real challenge, and my own perspective on that is that we have to pursue every strategy possible. If there was a clear path forward that one strategy can get us across the finish line, then obviously that's where we should devote all of our energy. But because there is no clear end line, I think that people in different positions can play their roles in different areas. If there is somebody who works in the diplomatic arena as an employee of the State Department who's going to put pressure on the administration from within about funding for UNRWA or whatever, that's the role this person plays. And I'm, again, not to defend, there's a lot of debate about what role we should all be playing and kind of the compromises that we have to make in the different places that we're positioned. But from my perspective, because I don't have a ticket for how we get to the finish line, I say people should look at what their strengths are. We were just talking a second ago in the back of the room. I'm not an organizer. If you send me into a town to organize the pro-Palestine movement, to put together a resolution at a city council or whatever, I would fail miserably. It's not my skill set. My skill set is discourse and media, and talking points and responding to propaganda. That's my strength. And it's the same in that people have their own strengths. And if people feel like they are well suited to operate in the diplomatic arena to reduce the harm of American policy, more power to you. And if people want to work on the grassroots level where there are less constraints, in which you don't have to moderate your tone and speak within Washington speak and whatever, and you can just state the truth bluntly and get people riled up and angry and organizing in order to do something about it, then that is absolutely what you should do. So I am in favor of a diverse movement in which we don't have to agree. There are many Palestinians who are active on this issue who I think do things that are stupid and unstrategic. There are a lot of people who think my approach is stupid and unstrategic, and that's okay. We can disagree with each other, we can disagree with the different approaches, but as long as we are all operating with our eye on the ball, that we are sincerely advocating for Palestinian freedom, and we are going about it in a way in which we are dedicated, committed, disciplined, and serious about achieving a change, I think people can just do their thing, and collectively, hopefully, we can figure out a way to cross that finish line and to feel that genuine sense of solidarity with people across the political spectrum, including people who engage on this issue in ways that I don't think are the most strategic or thoughtful. Nonetheless, I view them genuinely, sincerely as my community and my people, because we are all aggravated by the same overwhelming and debilitating injustice, and we're all trying to overcome it, and we will overcome it with time.
I think that's really, with everything that's been going on lately, we've had a lot of different groups show up, different organizations and little clubs and activities going on in our own separate towns, and it's kind of what do we even go behind? Who do we listen to? Where do we stand here? But I think that commentary that you just made was really valuable in saying that as long as we keep our mind on the ball, and have that our goal, a collective goal together, and we work towards it together, it's okay to have diversity. And those groups are going to bring their own unique traits to the movement. So I appreciate you saying that. I wanted to talk about the youth and the younger generation, keeping in fact that this conference is about Palestine as the future, and the youth are our future. So the younger generation of Palestinians is growing up in a vastly different world with new technologies and changing global dynamics. How do you see the aspirations and strategies of young Palestinians shaping the future of their struggle for liberation?
We are, and speaking about it specifically from a U.S. context, I think young people in this country are in a unique place, and a really promising one. When you look at opinion polls on what Americans think about Palestine and Israel, the generational divide could not be more glaring. Older Americans are stuck in an old way of thinking. They get their media from mainstream outlets that do the standard US-backed propaganda and whatever else. And young people are consuming media differently. Part of the reason why young people are more progressive is because they are growing up in college campuses where people like you are there. And you have your SJP chapter being super active, and the kind of exposure that you get to younger people through that is huge. It's very, very meaningful and significant, and the access to unfettered information through social media. I don't want to say praises to social media, it's got a lot of really harmful effects as well. But part of what's positive about social media is the ability to go around mainstream media outlets that operate within specific confines that limit the spectrum of debate, and being able to see the images that are emerging just now from Gaza. From my perspective, the heroes of this moment in terms of where we are in the US are the people on the ground in Gaza who are documenting and showing the world what is actually happening. Without that, we would be stuck in a very, very different environment right now in the US. And I don't want to dismiss, from my perspective, in terms of like what activism can look like, I don't want to dismiss the significance of pushing mainstream media outlets and applying pressure on them and emailing them and insisting on getting Palestinian voices on there, because that remains the platform through which an older generation, and more critically, the political class, get their information and their sense of what American discourse is. And so I think for the immediate present, we have to be present in those spaces as well. But you also have to be mindful of the fact that the younger generation consumes media very differently, and we have to build on that momentum. If I wouldn't even call it criticism, it's just a natural way of being at a different point in your life. For young people, it is, everything that they do is absolutely important. And again, I'm not discounting any of it. Complaining on social media is really important. Taking to the streets and protesting is incredibly important. These kinds of actions are absolutely critical. But they can't be an alternative to a serious political push to change things in Washington as well, to be politically engaged, to be calling your members of Congress, demanding a ceasefire and a change in policy, engaging in that critical education work. So I just would say that not to settle, one of the downside of social media is being able to settle in your own bubble and feel good that you're just among like-minded people who all agree. It's a relief in a world that is incredibly racist, and I'm not going to curse just in case there are kids here, really messed up world that where you need that sense of solidarity. You want to retract from mainstream media outlets in the political discourse to hold on to your sanity, because you're witnessing these atrocities, and the only place that feels where you can have that conversation where you agree on how insane that is to go onto social media around like-minded people. But you can't settle for that bubble on social media in which you tweet something or post something on Instagram, you get your several hundred likes and feel like, yes, we agree. But still the next step of how do you translate that into political action? And I think that that has to be still in the forefront. We don't all have the specific answers of how that can be done, but I think it has to be a critical part of the thinking for a young generation that wants to make change on this issue.
I do want to elaborate on one point that he made because it's very important, which is in my SJP work and whatever I do at Drew, I do feel like I've constantly, we've had so many conversations about oh, let's go do a march, let's go to this thing, let's go to that, a lot of action-based stuff, and then when I say, did you guys call your Congress members today? There's no answer. A lot of the students, the youth they're stunned, that's just not something that, at least maybe if you're newer to the movement too, that's kind of what I've been seeing. So I will say it's so important to remember what again, keep our eye on the ball and who are we appealing to, who are we demanding a ceasefire from, and just bring it back to that, because it's not, we have to be very direct in our actions, and that's the most direct that we can be. So my final question for you, and then we'll move on to the Q&A, is as the geopolitical landscape continues to shift, what potential scenarios do you see for the future of the Palestinian liberation movement, and how can activists and policymakers adapt to these changes?
I'll keep this one short so we can hear from the audience as well a little quicker. Look, what is undeniable is that we are in the presence of a huge turning point in which the future will not be like the past. How that unfolds exactly, I honestly do not have a clear answer. There are many scenarios that are possible that are on the table, including the one that I mentioned a little bit ago of a bigger confrontation between Lebanon and Israel that ends up becoming a regional conflict, and a very, very major one that might just fundamentally change the geopolitical reality of the Middle East and the superpowers' engagement with it as well. Russia and China and the United States' relationship with the region could also shift through that. The future is incredibly uncertain. We have right now, as a matter of emergency, disrupting what Netanyahu himself, the words he used, is thinning out the Gaza population. Whether they do that simply through the mass murder and starvation they're currently engaged in, or whether they have further plans in the impending attack on Rafah, in which they drive the population outside of the Gaza Strip. The urgency of stopping that, I think, trumps everything. And it's a very, very real and serious threat. And it's one that Israel feels very strongly about, because Israel's entire narrative, as a country that is proud of being an apartheid state, that sells itself that way to the world, the defense of why Israel is, Israeli officials constantly tell American Jews and Jews everywhere in the world that the countries that you're in are not home. This is home. This is where you have to come. And on the back of an event like October 7th, this idea that coming to this apartheid state is the way to safety is just transparently, obviously not the case. If you insist on living as an apartheid state in which you are stepping on the necks of other people and denying them freedom, that is a recipe for violence in which nobody is safe. And Israel is so desperate to restore the sense that it's a safe place that they're willing to obliterate Gaza completely off the face of the planet to restore their sense of deterrence and safety. That's the threat. And they're committed to it. And at some point we have to say who and what in the world is going to intervene to make sure that we don't get to that outcome. But if we are pushing in that direction, and the prospect of a bigger regional confrontation is very real, the future is incredibly uncertain, and it is honestly even difficult to speculate how things might get out of hand and what that plays out like. So it's, just a scary moment that things will never be the same, but we'll see which way it turns out.
Thank you so much for answering my questions and providing that insight. It's been an honor to learn from you. So I definitely want to open it up to everybody. Should I get up and pass it? Okay, I'll pass it to Ronnie, who's going to pass it. Oh, okay. There might be another mic, guys. Well, is it? Oh, there's this thing. I have no idea how to use this.
Assalamu alaikum. And thank you very much for coming here. It's always good to have a dialogue with activists and people who are immersed in the political arena here in the U.S. So a couple of points on activism here. So we have to leverage what happened in Michigan last week. And if we don't, then we'll remain voiceless. Just to remind everybody here, the whole focus here in the U.S. in the first times, I don't know, maybe in U.S. history, on Arab American and Muslims in the state of Michigan. And, we were all covered on nightly news on Tuesday. Why? Because Arab American for the first time had the opportunity to tip the scale toward, Democrat or Republican. So, my point is that I've been saying this for many, many years whenever we have a dialogue. We have to make sure that, to strengthen our representation here in the U.S. And the first thing that we have to do, we have to count ourselves here on the East Coast, especially. We have to do our own census in order to be effective here, because we are understated and underrepresented, and it's our own fault, all right? So when, I think I'm not sure, it's like a few months ago, when the head of the FBI, Christopher Wray, stood before Congress and testified that, just as a point of comparison, Jewish population in the U.S., 2.4% of Americans. How did he know this? If we look at the census, was that done by the government agency? Was it done by a private nonprofit organization? We have to do the same. So we have to strengthen our voice, we have to count ourselves, and we have to be effective in our dialogue. So when we have this, because when we have this, when we know our numbers, then we could be in a good position to influence the election and politicians. The second thing that I want to speak about is the tremendous influence of pro-Israel donors on the political campaigns, whether the threatening billionaires, Jewish billionaires, or pro-Israel to pull funding for schools, where we saw several Ivy League schools presidents resigned because some people, pro-Israel Jewish billionaires, to pull their funding from these universities. Also, at the U.S. scale, we see Republican candidate for presidents, compete. Who's gonna pulverize Palestinians first? Who's gonna marginalize us in the U.S. in Palestine? Nikki Haley, DeSantis. Who's gonna out-Trump Trump and do whatever they want to do to make us ineffective? So these are the things that we have to discuss among ourselves, how to be more, influencing in the election. We have to count ourselves. We have to, here in this district, we have Bill Baskerville, who's basically pro-Israeli, and we have a lot of large numbers of Palestinians here, and we have no voice basically. So we have to be, part of activism is that you have to run for Congress. We whole country recruit people here and pave their way. They could run for Congress, and they have the ability to run. We have young people. We have, a lot of people who are very educated and can have the ability to do that. So I'm sorry for the long speech here, but thank you very much.
Just two quick things I'll say about that. One, on the Arab American community, there is an organization called the Arab American Institute that tries to basically get an accurate count of the Arab American community, but they can only do so much. Obviously, it's a big country. The way to do it is by changing the form of the census. Right now, there's an effort led by the Arab American Institute to add a box on the next census that says MENA category under ethnicity, which is separate from race. People get confused about that. Many Arab Americans are technically white for reasons that are historically complicated. When there was the Asian Exclusion Act that used religious justification to say that people who are from the land of Jesus are white, it should be included. Be that as it may, if you're Lebanese and white, you can still be part of the MENA category. If you're Somali and black or Sudanese, that's fine too. So there's a race category and there's an ethnicity category. And there's an effort to make sure that that ethnicity box, saying MENA for Middle East, North Africa, is a box that is included on there. And that will give us a much better sense of our community's count, hopefully in the next census, because that seems to be on track to be on there. Trump tried to put, it was set to be on the last census, but then Trump took it off, but we're hoping that with the next census, that gets figured out. Because you spoke for a long time, if your introduction is short, I see that you wanted to jump in and say one more thing.
Just a follow up on what I just said. We're not going to count on the U.S. government to put us in the census. We have to do our own census. My point about Christopher Wray testimony before Congress about Jewish people 2.4%. How did he know that? There's no option on the census that says you're Jewish. How did he know that? So
I could not tell you to answer that, but yeah.
Like a non-profit organization, Jewish organization, that they counted themselves. Yeah. And maybe they overstated their count. I don't know. Okay, but
I hear you.
I don't know why. Who's going to lead this? Who's going to lead the catalyst?
The Arab American Institute is a good place to start. They do their own counts and stuff, so they have their own estimates based on the counts that they've done, but those are estimates. And if you wanted to actually get a technical count, I don't think there's a way around the census to do that as a technically accurate count rather than an estimate. So my guess would be that it's an estimate with the American Jewish community. On the question of the pro-Israel lobby, I'll just say quickly two things. One, I think it's useful not to conflate Jewish and Israeli on this particular point. Part of the movement for Palestinian human rights, groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, there is significant Jewish influence in support of Palestinian human rights. And on the opposite side, that's also true of the fact that the evangelical Christian base in the South is a significant force for pro-Israel policy and money and political pressure as well. But it's 100% correct in the sense that that influence is very significant, is very serious, that groups like AIPAC are putting up millions of dollars to defeat people in Congress who are sympathetic to Palestinian rights, and that's a real challenge, and we have to confront that. There's a sign of hope in the fact that AIPAC did mobilize against Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and Jamal Bowman and AOC and many others and have not been able to defeat them, but they've also mobilized against other people that they have been able to defeat. But at least it's a fight. It used to be a pre-drawn conclusion that if AIPAC and the pro-Israel lobby get activated, that means there's no hope for political survival. That is not the case anymore. They win some and they lose some. And that is absolutely a fight that our community should be engaged in, and it's worth supporting the candidates who are standing up for Palestinian rights.
I don't need a microphone. I'm Arab, so we're loud. So, speaking about, organizing and activism and us approaching this election year, we have groups that are saying that we should disengage in the election. We have we have third-party candidates that have risen at a degree in which I don't think we've really seen, at least within my lifetime. I would just love to hear more from you about the upcoming election and what your thoughts are when it comes to local elections and the major one that's coming up as well.
That is the hardest question and an unavoidable one. Obviously, we're on the cusp of a big moment, and the scale of the atrocity that Joe Biden is enabling is utterly inexcusable. And just for context, in the last election, I specifically made a video arguing that we have to vote for Joe Biden because getting Trump out of office was an emergency.
It worked for him.
Yeah. And this feels like a different moment. It just is. And the rationale for the first time around has not changed. If we're thinking in terms of the lesser of two evils, I have no doubt in my mind that Trump is going to be worse, not just on every other issue, but even this one. I don't know, you can imagine a scenario in which if Trump were president, he might be openly endorsing the full ethnic cleansing of Gaza and giving Israel the green light to just do it, as opposed to this lukewarm crap that we're getting from Joe Biden of just, it's a little too much and tone it down. It's adequately insufficient and infuriating when you hear Biden. But Trump, in fact, might be worse. Nonetheless, I can only speak for myself personally. I think what's happening in Michigan right now is absolutely crucial. It's the right way to do it. Before you even get to the point to where you might be empowering Trump and what that would mean and getting to that debate, making our voices heard now, that this is not okay with us. That Joe Biden cannot count us, take us for granted when he's getting our families slaughtered and our friends slaughtered in Gaza. That's not acceptable. And to use that as leverage for a shift in American policy in the meantime, I think is really important. Come down to the moment of the election, that is a hard one. Speaking for myself exclusively, and maybe my mind will change between now and November, who knows, I can't bring myself on a visceral level to cast a vote for Joe Biden. If I were to make a rational argument about the lesser of two evils, I think there's an argument for it, I can't do it. I'm not going to. People I know have been killed. People I consider to be personal friends have lost their mothers and daughters and aunts and uncles. A friend of mine, I had to listen to him explain to me how his mother stood on top of the rubble of a house in Gaza where her children and grandchildren had been killed, where she stood there for 36 hours shooing away dogs so they would not eat the bodies of her loved ones. A person who can defend policy like that is not somebody I'm capable of voting for, so I'm not going to do it. But in terms of a strategy, and it's complicated because the idea is you withhold your vote from Democrats, you teach them a lesson, and they come around the next time and they become more progressive and they do better. That was the thinking with the Bernie-Hillary thing in 2016. A lot of Bernie supporters, I wasn't one of them, I was a Bernie supporter, but I did not withhold my vote from Hillary Clinton. But a lot of people did, and they said the lesson is, you screw somebody like Bernie Sanders and you don't advocate for progressive foreign policy, you don't deserve our support. We got Trump, but what was the lesson? Did they not screw Bernie Sanders the next time around? So this idea that you can teach them a lesson is also uncertain, that we withhold our votes from Biden so that the Democrats would understand next time. It's a gamble, it's not guaranteed. But I do think that there is a difference in this moment, in that when Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump, you could not trace it to a single cause. It was complicated. Sexism in the United States, withholding votes from a woman, Trump being a very effective populist, Hillary not doing a good job campaigning in the middle of the country with working class people and so on. It's diffused. But if Biden loses this election because of Michigan, that's not diffused. He lost it because he supported genocide against people in Gaza. And I think that that could be a lesson the Democrats take actually and move forward with. But it's really, I can't say with confidence the implication of us costing Joe Biden the election and allowing Trump to be president, and then Trump comes along and does everything 10 times worse. There will be tension between us and the broader progressive community in this country about us having cost Biden the election and brought on just a horror and a level of plausibly fascism and undermining of democratic norms in this country. And if you add on top of that worse policy against Palestinians too, we're going to be in a tough position trying to have that conversation. So it's a complicated question, and I wish I had a silver bullet on that one, but yeah.
And as far as like the third party thing, like we've been working towards breaking away from the two-party system. We're finally talking about ranked choice voting, like on a level that I haven't seen before, and like we're in the primaries now. You really do you think that there's really any hope when it comes to like organizing with Jewish for Peace, WOL, and all these other organizations?
Yeah, to send a message, 100%.
To send a message about voting third party.
To send a message, but without any illusion that a third-party candidate can win the presidency in the current climate. Ranked choice voting is absolutely something that is worth investing in for the sake of American democracy broadly, not just on the issue of Palestine. I think it's something that we should be pushing for as well.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jenny McDavid from Houston, Texas. I have two questions about BDS. One is, I guess 37 states have passed anti-BDS laws, and what are current efforts to oppose them? I know we've had some legal cases, won and lost. CARE and ACLU have fought very hard, but I really would like to see more city and county attorneys sue their state attorneys general. My second question regarding BDS is, it seems like most of the boycotts are Israeli products or companies that do business with the settlements. What about are also targeting U.S. companies that contribute to APAC and the Super PAC and trying to dry up their businesses and dry up their money? Thank you.
The boycott issue, I think, is an extremely significant one because in addition to it being a method of pressure on Israel in light of the lack of will among world governments and the US government to act, is also an important free speech issue in the United States. Boycott, as part of American culture, it doesn't get any more American than that. The founding of the country, there was the boycott of British tea. In the civil rights movement, there was the Montgomery South bus boycott. It's part of American culture. It is enshrined in the US Constitution under the First Amendment. It was defended by the Supreme Court. The right to boycott is critical to free speech. It's the ability to put your money where your mouth is, and that is your political expression. In the fact that we right now exist in an environment in which the pro-Israel lobby is pushing, and in some cases, with the bragging of a foreign government in the state of Israel, saying they're part of the push to put these laws on the books that make it punishable for Americans to boycott Israel is absolutely and categorically outrageous. It is a situation in which, again, we talked about settlements as war crimes. There are laws that say not just boycotting Israel, but boycotting Israeli settlements is something that the American government can boycott, can punish you for in localities in different states where you can be denied contracts to work with schools and whatever. And in the case of one town in Texas during Hurricane Harvey, they said that in order to qualify for hurricane relief, to help get your house fixed after a hurricane, you have to sign a document that says that you do not boycott Israel. That is lunacy. It is not just lunacy, but it's so fundamentally un-American as well, that you have the right, and we have American politicians talking about boycotting Georgia because they're not doing better on Voting Rights Act, or boycotting this state for having anti-LGBT laws and so on. We're comfortable with our political leadership talking about boycotting American businesses in American states, but the war crimes of a foreign country are a red line that we can't boycott? That is just utterly ridiculous. And we have to, absolutely, pick up this fight. It is a critical one, and it's one that you can get broad American support for when people understand the issue. Because, as you said, the ACLU and other pro-civil rights giants in this country who do not care about Palestine separately, it's not an issue they work on, but just strictly about the fundamental right of Americans to have free speech are willing to engage on this issue, I think is really, really important. And to use it to highlight the extent to which our opponents are so afraid of free speech on this issue is also very telling. It tells you something about the shifting discourse. They can't win the argument on merit anymore. And so all they do at this point is tell us we're not allowed to boycott and try to weaponize the charge of anti-Semitism to silence people who are speaking out about Israel's atrocities against Palestinians. This is a free speech issue, and we absolutely should be fighting for it as such.
So there's a white Subaru in the parking lot. Can you please move it? Thank you. Okay, so unfortunately we need to wrap up by 1:45. So we have one question that came in from online. So I'm gonna answer that one, and then we'll wrap up. But if you guys have any questions, I think Omar would be okay for you guys to come and ask him after this is all over. But the question from online is definitely more lighthearted, so I think it's a good way to end it off. How can I do a better job in standing in solidarity with my American Palestinian neighbors and friends?
It's a sentiment, honestly, that I deeply appreciate. It's an understanding of how difficult a moment it is right now for Palestinians in the United States. I have to confess, these are the kinds of questions that I don't think about, so I feel like I want to end on a really eloquent, thoughtful note, and I find myself at a loss for, apart from just really appreciating that sense of solidarity, checking on your Palestinian friends and neighbors. There is not a single Palestinian that I know right now who is not dealing with a crisis based on the images that we are witnessing. It's simply knowing that people care, and that emphasizing that the American public is not the American government, that the dinosaurs who run the White House and Congress do not represent the will of the American people on this, because they don't. I think to the extent that that can be showcased, it's a way to push back against the sense of alienation that many Palestinians in the United States currently feel. It's a sentiment that I think is deeply appreciated, and
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming here today. It's been an honor to learn from you, for us all. I think this is definitely an experience that I'm going to remember for a long time, forever. So we would really like to center this conference on actions we can take for Palestine. Any last action items you want to give to the crowd and people online for what they can do going forward?
Absolutely. What we saw in Michigan, I think, was the most meaningful action, in my view, with this uncommitted vote. Calling your members of Congress, do it every day. It does not take that much time. It really is just a couple of quick phone calls to your senators and your member. And call your local media outlets and your national media outlets and demand a better narrative, a more accurate one, and demand that Palestinian voices be included in that coverage. We can speak for ourselves, and what is frustrating in this media narrative is that you've got the right end of the spectrum, right? You've got Fox News, in which Israel, good guys, Palestinians, bad guys, kill them all, is effectively the discourse on these networks. As disgusting as that is, it's not what bothers me, to be honest with you, because that's what you expect from kind of like overtly right-wing racist outlets. What bothers me a lot more is the liberal end of the spectrum, where the story is Israel, the protagonist, the good guys, Hamas, the bad guys, Palestinians, oh, poor Palestinians stuck in the middle of it, but it's really all Hamas's fault. This idea that Israel does not have agency, the idea that Israel is not deliberately responsible for the policies that it is deliberately choosing to pursue against civilians, I find more infuriating. The pretense that Palestinians are just victims of caught in the middle, collateral damage, nobody's intending to harm them. Israeli officials have been extremely explicit about the fact that the Palestinian civilian population is the target of their cruelty. Israeli commentators all over Israeli media, talk endlessly about wanting to punish the civilian population and gloating about it. Israeli soldiers do the same thing. Israeli snipers take out children, not just in Gaza, but in Jenin, on video. We had an American doctor who appeared on MSNBC not that long ago, based on a piece that they wrote in the LA Times, talking about going to Gaza to help. And all the children came in with a single sniper bullet wound to the head. These are not accidents. You don't kill that many children by accident, you just don't. And the fact that on the liberal end of the spectrum, we don't see people dealing honestly with the fact that Israel is engaging in deliberate atrocities against innocent people is infuriating. Words like disgusting and horrible and barbaric are reserved for one set of people and the violence they commit, while even more sadistic actions carried out on a far bigger scale are talked about as if they're just unintentional accidents and things we should do better on. That contrast is unacceptable, and it's one that we should challenge. And so in addition to the political activism, in addition to taking to the streets, I think demanding better of our media outlets, the very outlets that influence the way our politicians think and operate, and can apply more meaningful pressure on them, I think is something that is absolutely worth investing in. I do have the bias of being somebody who's more on the media discourse side of things, where to me that feels really, really important. And then finding out that somebody like Joe Biden watches Morning Joe religiously, and it's the Trumpiest thing you'll ever hear. But his own aides, when they want to influence the way he's thinking, they basically try to plot for guests to appear on Morning Joe. We have to influence that narrative that takes place on these networks, and that we have to do better there as well.
Thank you so much, Omar. Okay, can we get a final round of applause